Welcome to TESO Consulting Group's DEI podcast series, Why Is It So Hard? Shining Through the Shadow of Resistance. I'm Dr. Tonya Breland.
And I am Erika.
Welcome back.
Welcome back, everyone.
So glad that you joined us again.
Yes.
I'm Tonya.
And I'm Erika. And this is our podcast.
Yes.
Why Is It So Hard? Shining Through the Shadows of Resistance. And in this podcast, as we said before, our work is really to discuss issues that prevent us from being socially just, and free. And so the goal here is to disrupt the status quo of racial inequality and inequity in the system. And so each episode challenges us all to be the change that we want to see.
Yeah, it does. And we get challenged as well when we have these conversations, because we don't always solve the problems that we are talking about. But it's certainly worth talking about.
It is. These are those conversations that I think we need to have more of in our society. That we're just not having. We have them when something blows up, when something sensational happens, but we don't have nearly enough of them, and that's why we're here.
That is why we're here. So today we're going to talk about a topic that can make some people really uncomfortable too. Is privilege a real thing? Woo!
Child. I'm going to say yes.
I would agree that it is.
Yes.
But we know that there are those who resist that whole notion that privilege exists.
So why do you think that they would? I mean, we can see it, right?
Yes.
But why would someone deny or resist the notion that privilege exists?
So, I think it's easier to do that. Oftentimes what we'll hear is that I worked hard for what I got, for what I have, and for what I have in this world and what I've accomplished. And anybody can work hard just like I've worked hard. And we hear that and have heard that repeatedly in many spaces that we've been in and spaces that we've trained in.
We have.
So, I don't believe that privilege negates hard work. I think that is an interpretation. How would you describe privilege?
So I think privilege is those areas that we don't even have to think about. So I talk a lot when we do these trainings. I talk a lot about my height. So I am 5'4", and when I go to the grocery store, there are some things that I cannot reach, right? And it's not even, other people don't have to think about it, right? So there's something, the one thing that always gets me is like, I buy Goya rice, and Goya rice is always at the top, like, especially the family pack. It's always at the top. And if it's not like, if it's like maybe about 4 boxes back, I cannot reach it, And so I think it's those kinds of things. And other people don't even really think about it. And fortunately, maybe if my husband's with me, he can get it. Or if somebody walks by, then I have to ask, like, could you get this for me? But there's no thought to it, And so in that respect, buying slacks is another, issue. So I go to the store and buy a pair of pants, but I always know I'm going to have them, tailored or something like that, because these things are not made with me in mind. And so when you don't have to think of them, that's just a really small example. And again, with privilege, this is not something that I can earn. Like, I can't take a test to be tall. Right? So I can't earn my way into being tall. The reality is that when we look at leaders like presidents, everybody's over 6 feet tall. I mean, that is the trend. And so there's this real association with height and leadership. So those kinds of things. So when you don't have to think about it, you're probably privileged in that area, when you don't have to think about like an accommodation or can something be modified in some way to, so that I can have access in a way, you probably have privilege in that area.
Because for the most part, and there are some rare situations, for the most part, privilege is unearned.
Yeah.
It's an advantage or a benefit that someone has in society. I would say there is an exception specific to education. There's privilege that comes with having education, but we do earn that.
Sure.
But we can see where some folks may not have the opportunity to earn because they don't have,
they lack privilege.
Certain privilege.
That's right.
Right. And so like when you think about those areas of privilege that society deems as areas of privilege, what are some of the things that come to mind when you think about that?
So I think about race. Right? So white people in this country are privileged. I mean, there are things you can turn on the TV, you can see yourself, issues that, kind of matter to you, those things that you're interested in, like they're all around, right? As opposed to, as an African American, I had to really search to find, entertainment that might speak to my experience and to my interests. But I also think some other areas that we don't think about. So, being neurotypical, like that is an area of privilege. So people who are non-neurotypical, they have a harder time with society kind of really being accessible to them in some areas. So like within the workplace or even in school, I think hearing, that is a privilege. So, think about how many how many times you're like in a store or in a public place and the announcement is, over a loudspeaker. So especially in spaces where those announcements are, one of caution, if I'm deaf, I don't have access to that. And there's no other way to let me know that something is happening, or maybe I just need to be aware that there is, something else happening. There's an opportunity somewhere. And so those are just a few examples. But when I think about privilege, I think about like what it is that we cater to, or what it is that we actually, who has access to what and how.
Yeah. When you were talking about the deaf community, I was reminded of, recently we were doing an activity. It was a mindfulness activity. And one of the things that was a part of that was, asking the audience to close their eyes, not thinking about the fact that we had someone from the deaf community in our audience who, if their eyes are closed, aren't able to see, the signing for what to do during that mindfulness activity. And so, that we too fall prey of, enjoying the privilege of hearing that sometimes we don't have to think about, and we should be thinking about, or we didn't think about until after the fact, that we had someone in the audience who, if he closed his eyes, would not be able to see, what was being said.
Yeah.
And so, it's like I feel like this is something that we have to always be mindful of, and that we need to continue to grow in that area. We know an area that often upsets people is when we talk about white privilege, and even the privilege of being a man. And sometimes I use the example of, like some people will say, well, I'm a man, that I can't help that I'm a man, and that's, that doesn't make me have an advantage over someone else. However, if we think about the women's suffrage movement, women did not have the right to vote many, many years ago. And who is it that they asked permission to have the right to vote?
Men.
They asked men. They had to ask men. They didn't just say, oh, today I'm going to change the laws and I'm going to have the right to vote. They didn't have that privilege.
That's right.
They had to go to the men and ask the men to change the laws.
Yes. That's privilege.
That's privilege.
Right? When somebody comes to you and says, can we, and there are tons of examples in history
Sure.
of that, where someone without privilege had to go to someone with privilege
Right.
and ask for
Right.
a privilege in an area.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. You know, being heterosexual
Yep.
in our society is considered a privilege.
Yep.
You know, if you are a part of the LGBTQ community, you may find that there's backlash if you talk about your same-sex partner, especially when you say that this is my spouse.
Yes.
You know, where you and I can walk into a space and we can say my husband, and that is readily acceptable, and everyone is going to receive that, and it's not going to be a challenge.
Yeah, it's almost expected, right? It's acceptable, and it's expected.
Right.
This is the norm. This is kind of like the path that everybody's on, right? There's
But groups, you know, there are
Yeah.
groups of people in society that are often looking for either permission
Yes.
or opportunities to be extended to them because society has not provided those
Yeah.
opportunities.
Right. That's right.
And that happens on a regular basis. Recently, we saw a situation in the news where a gentleman who was running for office was in a wheelchair
Yes.
and was told that he needed to come onto the stage. And what I saw afterwards was just heartbreaking. He was trying to get out of his wheelchair to accommodate the request, and that never ever should have happened.
That's right. That's
I mean,
right.
it just should not.
Yep.
Should never have been brought.
Even a
I mean,
thought.
there should not have been a thought. But you know, some able-bodied individual thought that that was
That this is the only way for candidates to express their thoughts, their opinions, and to debate in this particular, was to be on this stage.
Right.
Like this was the only space, this is the only venue, and this is the only way. And I think that that's privilege, right?
that's privilege.
That's privilege.
That's privilege.
That's privilege. That's
Yeah.
privilege. So then, okay, so we just kind of rattled off like a few examples. So again, going back to, why are people so resistant to even acknowledging that privilege exists, you know, and that they have privilege, right? Because the truth is, you can be privileged in some ways and not in others, right? So the fact that we're educated, college educated,
Right.
that is an area of privilege. Tonya is taller than 5'4", so she's privileged in her height, but we're African American females, and so in that respect,
Right.
we are not.
Right.
We don't enjoy privilege
Right.
in this society, right?
Right.
So there are some spaces in which we can have privilege on the one hand, but on the other hand, you know, we don't. So can I ask you then, so when you see, like, when you realize that part of your identity is, like, as your social identity is marginalized in one way, but then another part of your social identity actually enjoys privilege in another way, like, what does that do? Like, do you think that makes you more of an ally in some areas? Like talk about what that might do in terms of like that intersectionality.
So you bring up a really good point, and it can be quite complex and can be a struggle, because I can be in a space because of my education. I can be invited into a space because someone believes that my level of education brings value to a conversation. But I could be sitting there in a room full of men, and I could say something and not be responded to.
Sure.
And or there could be a scenario where I say something and no one responds to it favorably, and then a man can say it, and all of a sudden it's a good idea. And I've been in those kinds of spaces before.
Yeah.
Or I could be the only black woman or black person in a room.
Yeah.
And the same thing could happen. I might have been invited there because of my education, you know, and what I bring from a professional standpoint. But when I lend my voice to the situation, it could be that I'm not heard.
Yeah.
Or it could be that I'm talked over, or that I'm not even given the room and the space to speak.
Yeah.
And I've also been in those situations and in those rooms as well. And so it's really complex.
Yeah.
Because, it's like, hey, I have something of value that I can add to this conversation. And it's almost like, again, needing to ask permission of those who have, other privileges to give me the room to be able to share, what it is that I need to that I need to share. And that, creates some negative feelings. And it's like, I'm being marginalized in two other ways, where I might have privilege in another way. And it can be a struggle, in those situations. And I really have to navigate, how am I going to respond to this?
Yeah.
And how do I approach this in a manner that's going to give voice to other people who are just like me, and not close further doors because I don't have the power in that space, and it's like something that, I really have to like weigh the circumstances and the consequences. Like,
Sure.
Are there going to be negative consequences that come to me for addressing the areas where my privilege, is not present? And sometimes that's a risk.
Yeah.
And am I willing to take that risk? And I have to like go through these questions and like almost gymnastics in my mind about, how am I going to address this in this space?
Yeah.
Am I going to lose, am I going to lose an opportunity to even be in the room because I speak up?
The social capital that we
Right.
talked about,
Right.
Yeah.
Because it could be that my speaking up is offensive.
Yeah.
And that there's resistance to my speaking
Sure.
up against how I might have been marginalized in that space.
Sure.
And so it's not an easy thing,
No.
when you don't enjoy privilege in a lot of different areas.
Yeah, I agree. I think there are times when, for me, I realize the extent to which, what areas of privilege have given me access into a certain context or a situation. But I think I'm also sensitive to those that may not have it, and why. So, for instance, previously we talked about a state agency that we worked for. So being able to engage in a certain, series of meetings, but then someone with a rank, if you will, or lower, not really being able to have access to this space, even though they might have the insight and the perspective that we need in this case. Like they carry with them the expertise that would really actually get us to a place, move us forward in whatever this issue. And I was always kind of aware of that, always aware of like, why am I here? And then also almost kind of championing in those spaces where, I feel like, others without privilege don't have access to. I find myself being a bit more sensitive in those areas. So though I'm Christian, I am sensitive to areas where there's like anti-Semitism or anti, I think it's like Islamophobia is like, I'm really sensitive to that, because though I enjoy, religious freedom and acceptance, I think, in our country, I'm still sensitive to those who don't. And, there is an awareness, I think that we might carry. But I want to go back to something that you said about, this idea of work. Right. So someone saying, I don't have privilege. I worked for everything that I have. And so this idea that what we're saying around privilege is that you've been given everything, as opposed to you working for it. I think the challenge that I have with that statement is that when somebody says, I don't have privilege, I worked for everything that I have. Like, clearly there are people who don't have what you have. So is the implication that they don't work hard as well? I think that's the thing that I probably get if it's going to, if I'm going to get triggered around something in this conversation around privilege, and the response is really going to be this idea that, you're the only one that worked hard, or you're the only group that worked hard,
Right,
and these
right.
other groups did not.
Right. Right, because what happens is that individual typically is not aware of, other people's circumstances and where barriers exist in society, so we still see gender pay gaps that exist. So yeah, the woman may be working hard to get to a level of, a level in their workplace, for example, of position of leadership. And she may be working hard, but in the end, she still may be making less than the men
Yes.
in her same field, same position. Like, we know that that's an issue that currently exists in society, currently.
Yes.
And so it's like, so then the woman has to work that much harder to be able to earn the same thing that a man
Right.
earns.
That's
Oftentimes working double that, just to be able to have the same earning potential.
Right.
And so it's like, and so clearly I get triggered too. Because I just
Right?
noticed in my
Yeah.
body, being mindful that there was a little rise, that, I was getting a little more animated and feeling a little bit more challenged. And I think what often also happens, especially where race is concerned in our country, as a Black person, we often have not had the opportunities
Right.
even extended to us.
Sure.
So it's like we can work as hard as we want.
Right.
But when we look at who's in what positions in society,
Right.
who holds what jobs, we look at the individuals who holds the most menial task in society.
Yeah.
They often are people of color.
Right.
People
right.
of color typically are not the ones that are leading all of the different organizations
right.
that are out there,
right.
or leaders in government. Yes, there are some, but overall, our people of color
That's right.
often do not enjoy the same privilege of being able to advance in careers or advance in education. It's not uncommon, we know this to be true, that, the under-resourced schools are the schools that serve Black and brown children in
Yes.
communities where, children are living in families that are living below the poverty level.
Yeah.
So like there's a whole host of reasons that people haven't seen or even noticed or even had to notice.
That's right. And I think that last piece is really key. They haven't had to. They haven't had to notice or grapple with or deal with or just sit with. Like, some things just aren't fair, right?
Right.
Like a lot of groups have had to just sit with that. Some things just aren't fair. And so, so I think we've kind of really explored what it is and how it manifests itself in society. So what do you do?
Yeah.
So what do you do? So what do you do now that we know this? Let's say I have privilege in an area. What can I do?
Well, you can lend your privilege to someone who doesn't.
Sure.
And we see that as a part of allyship.
Yeah.
Which is also another conversation that we should have. But that's just one thing that you can do. What else do you think can be done?
I think, I think it goes back to what we were talking about before, where you have privilege in one area and you lack privilege in another. And I think in those spaces where you realize that you have privilege, you have a voice, you're in the room or you have access or opportunity. And so how can you use that access and opportunity to support someone who doesn't have the same access and opportunity? So the example that I gave, I'm sitting in this meeting and I realize that the person with the expertise has not been invited to this meeting. That would give them exposure. Very often with these meetings, you get exposure and all that other kind of stuff. So
And access.
So then as an ally, what I could say is, I know Tonya, she's not in this meeting, but she has, expertise in this area. Why don't we get her here? So that's me speaking up and providing Tonya, who may not have the same credentials in a certain area that I have, but bringing her into the meeting and giving her that space and that voice. I think that's one of the things that we could do.
We often hear the statement, it's not what you know, it's who you know.
Sure.
And I think that statement, so I've heard that statement since I was probably in college. I don't know if I heard it in high school, but I can recall hearing it, probably as early as my college years. And I've been out of college for a few years, a few decades. I might not look like it. No, but ultimately, the who you know reminds me of the position I might not have in society. So I've heard that statement over and over again. And I can't tell you how many times I've thought, I don't know the people. I don't know the people that could get me access to greater opportunities. Because where I sit as a Black person or as a Black woman, I don't have access to those individuals who might be able to, move me along in my career path.
Right.
Or who might be able to, write a letter of recommendation for something, or who might be able to say, hey, here's a business loan. Like I might not know the people who are going to give me access because of where I sit in society or the lack of privilege that I have. And so I often struggled, and when I heard that statement being made, because it was a reminder of the privilege that I didn't have.
Yeah, I think that's really key. I was having a conversation over the weekend with some friends who their daughter's in college, our daughter's in college, and we were talking about the difference, just along those same lines, in their experiences. So there are things that they know because we had access to it, right? And so there were things that they knew to do our daughters knew to do on a college campus that we didn't know because, my parents, we were first generation. And so there were just some things that I just didn't know I could do. I didn't know that I could ask for accommodations. I didn't know that I should probably be talking to my professors or meeting with my professors if I had an issue.
I didn't even know you could take the SATs multiple times.
That's it.
As a kid, I did not know that.
And so there are these things that our kids know because we kind of have had these experiences. And I think that goes back to kind of like the networking and the who do you know. It's like, so we lend our privilege to our kids, right? So our kids come up and they know it because they've heard us talk about it. We provide them with the manual. Like we literally give them the manual. You need to do this, this, and this, right? And I think again, but it goes back to kind of lending your privilege. So our kids have it, but what about the kids who don't? What about the kids, who don't know? What about the kids who don't have, kind of like that access or that understanding?
Right.
And I think that's really important when we talk about privilege. It's like, how do you use, we talked in the beginning in the intro about being the change that we want to be.
Right.
So how can we use our privilege to be the change that we want to be?
Right.
Yeah.
And I think it's like as we, we don't have privilege as Black women, but we do have privilege as educated people.
Right. Yep.
And so as educated people, we can lend our privilege
That's right.
to others who may not be educated. And we also have privilege having worked in, state government and having had leadership roles in state government, which created visibility. That allows us to have some access that we may not have had before. Which can give us an opportunity to open doors for others.
That's right.
So when I talk about the complexity of privilege or where we do have privilege and where we don't have privilege, it is very complex because there, it's not, black or white, literally it's not simple,
Right.
So when individuals say, well, I worked hard for this, there's a narrative in America, centered around this, I worked hard for this.
Right.
And that narrative often invalidates others or invalidates others' experiences.
That's right.
Who may also be working hard,
That's right.
but don't have the access, don't have the opportunities, and don't have the privilege.
That's right. That's right. And so I think as we close this episode out, one of the things that I think we all need to continue to do is really unpack those areas that we have privilege in. So really think about, do you have privilege in terms of race, gender, culture, language, height, right? Sexuality,
ability,
Religion.
religion.
So what are those areas that you have privilege, and then how can you use that privilege to help those who who do not. And we can't answer that question for you because we all kind of flow in different contexts. But, I think really thinking about, so an area of privilege could be, the next time you hear or see or notice that someone is being marginalized, speak up. Just speak up, and you don't necessarily have to flip tables over or anything like that, but it would be good for you to, just say like, okay, so that sounds, what you just said sounds sexist, or what you just said, it sounds racist, and here's why I'm saying that. I think that could be really, really helpful when we talk about being an ally. Now that's not so hard, is it?
No, it's not. But somebody will probably try to say that it is,
Somebody
but it really isn't. It really isn't.
Yeah.
So we do thank you for joining us today, and we invite you to just share your thoughts. What do you think about this topic of privilege? Is it real to you? What do you think? And give us some of your feedback. We're on all social media platforms, and so we would love to hear your thoughts. Again, I'm Tonya.
And I'm Erika.
And thank you for joining us.